unjustly kicked my brother out of the house despite the fact that he has always helped and supported me for 10 years. 5 years ago, I found myself in a difficult but important situation. My brother Alexei, whom I had always considered a close friend and support, was facing unexpected difficulties. He had lost his job, and to make matters worse, his wife Marina was expecting their first child. I realized that this was one of the most stressful times in their lives, starting a new family, financial difficulties, and an uncertain future. I was living alone at the time in a spacious house that I had inherited from our parents. The house was quite large, and I didn't think adding 3 more people to my space would be a problem. I was happy to help, as family has always come first for me. My brother and his wife are my significant others, and I always knew I would help them when they were in a difficult situation. So without thinking long, I offered them to move in with me. My brother and I talked over the offer. He was grateful and promised that they would only stay a few months until he found a job and got his financial situation straightened out. At that point, I was full of optimism. I had a stable job, no debt, and I felt I could afford to take on my expenses. It was a temporary solution, I thought at the time, and I felt like things would get back to normal after a while. 5 years have passed. The time that I then envisioned as a temporary transition period has turned into a long-term cohabitation. A lot has changed in my brother's life since then. He found a job a few months after moving in, and their family has grown. They now have 2 children, both of whom were born in my house. The house was constantly filled with the sounds of children's cries, footsteps, and games. Of course, I understood that living with children was natural and that screams and noise were part of everyday life. But something inside me was different. The peace and quiet that I was used to was gone. The brother and his wife have also changed. When they first moved in with me, there was a sense of gratitude. The brother often expressing his appreciation for my help. But over time, that tone has changed. Now it felt like a matter of course. They no longer seemed to notice that I was paying some of the bills and providing a roof over their growing family's head. Sure, Alexei had started contributing to some of the bills, but that didn't cover everything, and I increasingly felt like I was paying for a life I hadn't chosen. Every day I felt more and more like an outsider in my own home. My personal space became more like a guest house, with no room for me. I tried to adapt, to convince myself that it was temporary, that my brother would soon find a way to move out. But as the months passed, nothing changed. My conversations with him became more and more strained, and although I tried to avoid conflict, the tension grew. There were moments when I tried to justify the situation to myself. That's my brother, I told myself. He would help me if I were in his shoes. I tried to imagine what it would be like for me if I were in his shoes, with a wife, kids, and no stable job. But every time I came home tired after a long day at work and couldn't find any privacy, all my attempts to calm myself fell apart. I wanted silence. I wanted peace. I wanted to feel like a master in my own home, not like a temporary resident among a noisy family. 5 years passed. Finally, on one of those days when I felt the fatigue and tension particularly acute, I decided to talk to my brother. It wasn't easy. I had so many fears inside of me. How would he react? Would he think I was selfish? After all, I know how hard it is to find a place to live, especially with 2 children. But on the other hand, don't I deserve privacy and space to myself? Isn't 5 years a long time for temporary help? When I finally worked up the courage to talk to him, it was one of those evenings when the house was particularly noisy. The kids were playing and my brother and his wife were watching TV. I approached him and suggested we talk privately. We sat down in my room, the only place where I could shut myself away from everyone. I started by acknowledging how difficult it was for them at first, and that I was glad I could help. But then I explained that this situation had been dragging on for 5 years, and I was beginning to feel trapped in my own home. I explained that I needed space for myself, that I could no longer handle the noise and the constant presence of other people. It was a tough conversation. Alexei's reaction was just as I had feared. He was shocked and hurt. He told me that he hadn't expected this from me, that he didn't think I could ask them to leave. He reminded me how much I meant to them when they were in a difficult situation and how much they counted on me. At that moment, I felt a huge sense of guilt rising up inside of me. Maybe I really was acting selfishly. Maybe I should have been more patient. Maybe I had misjudged the situation. That conversation affected our relationship. My brother began to behave differently. We no longer talked as freely as we used to, and there was always tension in the house. Marina, his wife, began to avoid me, and I felt that they had started looking for a new place to live, although they did not tell me directly. But on the other hand, I was also relieved. Perhaps for the first time in many years, I allowed myself to recognize that I too had a right to peace and privacy. I realized that I can't be everything to everyone, and that sometimes you have to take care of yourself, even if it causes conflict. Of course, these emotions are mixed. Guilt still sits deep inside me, but at the same time I feel that it was the right thing to do. It's been a few months since we first talked. My brother's family has really started looking for a new place to live, and although it's taking longer than I expected, the process is underway. They've already looked at a few options, and by the looks of it, they'll be moving out soon. I sometimes wonder what will happen next. Our relationship with my brother may change forever, but I hope that over time we can rebuild what we had. I'm sure we've both learned something important from this situation. He about not taking help for granted, and I about taking care of ourselves before we can help others. Relocation and new circumstances. A few weeks later, my brother's family did move. The house they found was smaller and further from the center, but according to Alexei, it was the best they could afford at the moment. I offered to help them with the transportation of their belongings, but they, perhaps feeling that they had already depended on me enough, decided to manage on their own. On the day of their move, I watched them load their belongings into a rented truck. On one hand, I was relieved. My house was once again becoming mine alone, and I could finally have the privacy I had dreamed of for the past few years. But on the other hand, there was an uneasy feeling in my chest at that moment. Questions swarmed in my head. How would our relationship go on? Had I ruined something important by trying to reclaim my space? After they left, the silence I had longed for suddenly became deafening. The house, which had seemed too small before, now seemed huge and empty. I felt lonely for the first time in a long time. Until then, I hadn't even realized how accustomed I was to the presence of other people. Sure, I was annoyed by the noise, the chaos, but at the same time it made me feel like I had a family around me. And now that they were gone, I began to realize how familiar their presence had become. These thoughts made me feel even more guilty. Had I kicked them out to get the silence, and now I couldn't enjoy it? Getting used to a new life. A few months passed, and I gradually began to adapt to my new life. I spent my free time after work doing hobbies that I hadn't had time for before. I started reading more, working in the garden that I had neglected long ago, and even got a dog to keep me company. The silence I had longed for was finally beginning to be satisfying. I could rest without the sounds of others and without worrying that someone would constantly disturb my peace. At times, however, I still thought about my brother and his family. We rarely saw each other, and when we did, our conversations were strained. I realized that our relationship would never be the same again. Alexei held himself aloof, as if he was still nursing a grudge for me forcing them to move out. I tried not to lose touch with him. I called, invited them to visit, offered to help with the children, but he refused or made excuses. It was hard to accept, and I often wondered what I could have done differently. Reconnecting. About a year went by, and one day I got a call from my brother. He invited me to his house for lunch. It was unexpected, since we had only been in formal contact for the past few months. I agreed, even though I didn't know what to expect from the meeting. When I arrived, the children were surprisingly calm, and Marina greeted me with a smile, which seemed like a good sign. During lunch, we chatted about various trivialities: work, the weather, the children. Everything was going smoothly, but I felt that Alexei had something to say, and as it turned out, I was right. After lunch, when the children had gone to play in their room, he suddenly started a serious conversation. "Listen," he began, "I wanted to tell you something. It's been a while, and I've been thinking a lot about how everything happened. To be honest, I was really angry with you at the time. I felt like you just kicked us out when we needed support the most. But now that I look back, I realize you were right. We depended on your help for too long, and it really became our comfort zone. We probably never would have moved out if you hadn't insisted. And you know what? Now I'm glad it happened." I froze as I listened to his words. Was this the reconciliation I'd been waiting for? Alexei continued. "We were able to find our own place, and it made me take on more responsibility. Yes, it was hard in the beginning, but it was necessary. And I want to thank you for giving us a boost. I'm sorry I didn't realize it before." Those words were a great relief to me. I felt the weight that had been hanging over us finally disappear. Our relationship, though changed, began to return to a more friendly, open state. I realized that sometimes the hard decisions we make can lead to better outcomes, even though it's not always immediately obvious. A new chapter. Now, after a while, our relationship with my brother and his family has reached a new level. We still supported each other, but the boundaries between us had become clearer. We now had separate lives, and it made us appreciate the time we spend together more. I continue to live in my home, enjoying the peace and privacy I so desperately needed. Alexei, in turn, has become more self-sufficient and independent, and I'm proud of him for the way he has coped. We both realize that even the closest people can't live next to each other all the time without violating each other's boundaries. The time spent apart taught us a lot and helped us to restore our brotherly unity, but at a new level of maturity and mutual understanding. Each meeting now reminded me that family is not always about living together or constant support. Sometimes it is more important to respect each other's personal boundaries and to be able to let go, to allow everyone to develop. Unexpected event. It had been a few months since my brother and I had reconciled. Our relationship had improved, but it was still not the same as before. We saw each other from time to time, and each time the communication became more friendly. I felt that we were gradually restoring the brotherly bond. Life was going on again. I was enjoying my privacy. My brother and his family were getting used to their new home, and it seemed that only bright days were ahead of us. But one night, something happened that completely turned our lives upside down. It was an ordinary evening when I received a call from Alexei. He was calling in a panic. His voice was shaking, and I immediately realized that something terrible had happened. "We were robbed," he exhaled. "We just got home and everything is upside down. Our stuff is gone. I don't know what to do." I didn't hesitate to get in my car and drive to them. My first thought was that they were all safe. Money and belongings are one thing, but family is another. I tried to call the police to find out what was going on, but Alexei had already called them. When I arrived at their house, the picture I saw was horrifying. The front door had been broken in, furniture scattered all over the apartment, things lying on the floor as if the burglars were looking for something valuable. The children's room was especially creepy. Their toys were scattered and broken. Marina sat on the couch, trying to calm the children while Alexei paced back and forth across the room, as if he couldn't find a place to sit. His face was contorted with a mixture of anger and fear. The police were already on the scene, examining the house and taking fingerprints. "They took everything valuable," Alexei said, as we sat down in the kitchen. "But it wasn't even about the money. They broke into our house, into our space. The kids are afraid to sleep now. I don't know how we're going to live here anymore." My brother's words were full of despair. I understood that losing things was one thing, but the psychological shock of a home invasion was much greater. A home should be a place of safety and comfort, but now it had become a place they could no longer see as their refuge. The impact of the robbery. Over the next few days, the situation only worsened. The children's fear, the tension in Alexei's relationship with Marina, all of this increased. They did not feel safe in the house where they had been attacked. Alexei said he couldn't sleep at night listening to the slightest sounds all the time. Marina also felt anxious, and the children were afraid to sleep alone. These were not just the consequences of the robbery, they were the consequences of a loss of a sense of security. At the same time, I realized that my bond with my brother had grown stronger. Despite all the past disagreements, I was willing to help them in any way I could. I offered them to come back to me temporarily until they found a solution or regained a sense of security. At first, Alexei refused. He didn't want to be a burden to me again, especially after everything that had happened in the past. But eventually, under the pressure of the circumstances, they agreed. Returning to my home, being back at my house again, Alexei and his family felt strange. It was like a return to the past, but with a tangible shadow of the changes that had taken place. I wasn't about to let it turn into a repeat of a previous experience. We immediately discussed the terms and conditions of their stay, so that it would be clear and understandable for everyone. But this time, the situation was different. This was not temporary help, but rather emergency support. They were not planning to stay here for a long time, and that gave us all a relief. While they were living with me, Alexei was actively looking for a new place to live, and he also strengthened the security measures in the old house to minimize the likelihood of another burglary. I hired a company to install video surveillance and an alarm system, which also helped my brother feel more secure. Nevertheless, the moral and emotional consequences of the robbery continued to have an impact. The children could not sleep well for a long time, and Alexei and Marina often argued over small things. I realized that this stress was destroying their family and tried to support them as much as possible. An unexpected twist. A few weeks later, police reported the arrest of the robbery suspects. It turned out to be a group that specialized in burglaries in suburban areas. They chose houses without security systems and acted quickly and in cold blood. Alexei and Marina attended the trial as victims, and when the judge handed down the verdict, it seemed to bring them some relief. But the return to normalcy was slow. By this time, my brother and his family were still living with me, but it was noticeable that they were beginning to calm down. The children gradually stopped being afraid of the night, and Marina and Alexei began to spend more time with each other and the children, which helped to restore harmony in their relationship. Reflections on family. One evening, when the children were asleep and Marina had gone to the store, my brother and I were sitting in the kitchen. Alexei was immersed in his thoughts, and I realized that he needed to speak. "You know," he began, "when we moved back here, I thought it would be a repeat of the same situation as before, that you'd be uncomfortable with our presence again. But now I realize it's different. That time we lived here, without thinking about the fact that you needed your space too. I realize now that this isn't just help, it's your sacrifice, and I'm grateful for that. I felt his words make me think. 5 years ago, I was furious that they were stuck with me. But now I realize that a real family is not just people close by blood, but those who are ready to support each other in the most difficult moments. We are all growing up, I said. And sometimes we need to go through such trials to understand each other better. The important thing is that we are together and that we can move forward. Alexei nodded, and in that moment I felt that we were really closer than ever. This robbery, oddly enough, had helped us strengthen our relationship and realize how important we were to each other. Hard times not only destroyed, but also built new bonds between us. Decision on vacation. For the first few days, I just enjoyed this peace. My only goal was to relax and do nothing. I walked along empty beaches, read books I had long wanted to read, and just sat on the veranda watching the sunsets. In the silence of these days, I began to feel the tension gradually fade away, and my thoughts become clearer and clearer. Reflections on the past. One evening, sitting on the beach and watching the sun sink below the horizon, I began to reflect on what had happened over the past few years. All this time, I had been trying to help my brother and his family, to support them, to be there for them, but in the process, I had forgotten to take care of myself. I've always been a person who puts the needs of others first, sometimes even to the detriment of my own needs. It was only now, in this calmness, that I realized how much it had drained me. I thought about how our lives changed through an ordeal such as a robbery. This incident shattered the peace of my brother's family, but it also made us all look at our relationships in a new way. I realized that even the scariest moments can be opportunities for growth and reflection. But now on this shore, I decided it was time to think more about myself. Perhaps for the first time in a long time, I felt free of other people's expectations. Yes, I love my family, but I also realized that taking care of myself is just as important. This realization came to me gradually, but it was a defining moment. New acquaintances. One day, walking along the coast, I met an elderly couple, Anton and Svetlana, who had lived in this town for many years. They were good-natured and friendly, invited me to dinner, and soon we began to become friends. We often met in the evenings, talking about life, the past, and the future. They shared their stories about how they had moved here to find peace after years of working in the big city. Anton, a former literature teacher, taught me to look at life differently. He told me that each of us goes through our own trials, but it is important to remember that hard times are not the end. It's just one chapter in our book of life. His wisdom helped me look at my own problems from a different perspective. I began to realize that the robbery and all the hardships that followed were just another test to get through in order to become stronger. Homecoming. A few weeks passed, and I felt ready to go home. This vacation not only gave me a chance to recuperate, but also to rethink many things in my life. I realized that I needed to learn how to balance caring for others with caring for myself. When I got home, everything seemed a little different. My home was no longer a place where I felt lonely or tired of life. I now saw it as my personal space that I had to cherish and respect. I set clear boundaries for myself, not only in terms of family, but also in terms of work, friends, and personal time. And I also realized that my relationship with my brother and his family had changed for the better. We became closer, despite all the trials we had been through. Now that they have found their place and life is stable again, our relationship has become more open and honest. Alexei stopped seeing me as a source of help and me as someone who constantly has to do something for him. A new chapter. Now looking back, I realized that the robbery and all the events that followed were a turning point in my life. I learned to let go of control and accept help from others, and I learned to listen to myself and my needs. It wasn't just